All right, all right. We are live. We should be live. We've been sticking with the YouTube live as opposed to the Facebook live for a few weeks here, just because the way it is, it's just so easy to share and everyone can get access to it. It's all about being able to have access to the live teaching as an extra value bonus for people who are going through our programs. And so this is what we decided to do. So hopefully this is of value to you. Let me know in the comments if you're able to. All right. So, if you can't catch this live, of course, I always say this, but just a reminder that you can always check this on replay. It does automatically record. And so that'll be helpful to you. If you're catching this live as well, and maybe you just ran across this channel, I offer one-on-one online tutoring, math packages, and also we do some courses, Algebra Made Simple, Math Made Simple, just to name a couple. And so anyway, this is an added benefit. So let's go ahead and get into it. I have a I have a variety of topics I'm going to touch on real quickly here. And this is just meant to give you a little, give your learner a little more, I don't know, not hand holding, but a little light touch to refresh them what we learned this week, remind them of the content, and to give them maybe even a little more insight that we weren't able to cover during our hour together. So the first one I want to talk about, and this is for my Algebra Made Simple people. Some depending on what week you're in, you may have covered this topic already, or you may just now be kind of dipping your toe into this. But we're working on a skill that's very common in algebra and algebra 2, where you have to do what's called factor, right? You have to be able to factor polynomials. There's a lot of different reasons why you're going to have to learn that, but you're frankly going to be tested on factoring quite a good bit. A lot of times it's during maybe the beginning of the second semester or the end of the first semester. We're talking like December into January. A lot of times when you start picking up this skill set. But then there's so many uses, like how to solve quadratic functions and, oh man, interpreting graphs and coming out with all kinds of applications. So let's go ahead and get into a discussion. So I'm going to talk about factoring and what that is for a second. Then I'm going to show you a couple examples or so when it comes to a polynomial, and then we're going to keep it rolling. Okay. So first off, when I say factor, what I'm really saying are two smaller components of a greater thing. For example, the number 10. You could factor the number 10 because you have to ask yourself, well, what are two other numbers, usually two smaller numbers, right, than 10, that if you multiply those numbers would equal 10, right? So, you start thinking that through, and you're going to come up with, well, I think some factors of 10 would be maybe Chris. I think 10 and 10, not 10, but maybe 2 and 5. Excuse me, 2 and 5, right? 2 times 5 is equal to 10, and you would be correct. And so we would say 2 and 5 are factors of the number 10. You could also go with maybe even 1 times 10, because at the end of the day, 1 times 10 is also equal to 10. So these four numbers right here are considered factors of the number 10, right? So how do we know they're factors? Because if I were to re-multiply those numbers to each other or times each other, I'm going to end up getting what I had originally. If I multiply 2 times 5, I'm going to get 10 again. If I multiplied 1 times 10, I'd get 10 again. So this is the foundation of what we understand and how we apply it even when it comes to polynomials. Now, you might be asking yourself, Chris, what is a polynomial? I don't remember. Well, if you paid attention in our courses, you learned that polynomials are simply a bunch of terms, maybe not even a bunch of terms. It could be one to many, right? But it's usually several terms that are separated by either addition or subtraction signs, okay? You're not going to see division, multiplication when it's a polynomial. It's literally strung together by either addition or subtraction. So let me give you a very basic definition here, okay? So let's say you had, I don't know, we'll do 7x squared minus 21x, okay? This is an example of a polynomial. And the reason we say it's an example of one is because there are two terms and they are separated by subtraction. Remember, it can be separated by either addition or subtraction, right? So this is the example specifically of a quadratic binomial. Quadratic means the degree is 2. See how the exponent is 2 there? But there are 1, 2 terms, and so we come up with the term binomial. This is a quadratic binomial. And you're going to be asked this week and in your Algebra 1 course to factor by a process called GCF. We call that the greatest common factor. Okay. Well, you got to start by looking at what are called the coefficients. The coefficients are the big number attached to the variable in front, right? So we're talking about the 7 and we're talking about the 21 in this example, okay? And the question is, what is the greatest factor that both 7 and 21 have in common? So you might want to start by thinking about it, or if you're more visual or you have a hard time focusing and you got to know yourself, it's never a bad idea to list it out on paper so you can look at it with your own eyes. For example, the only factors that go into 7 are 1 times 7. Those are the only numbers that multiply to 7. That's pretty easy. It's a prime number. But when you get to 21, you have lots of different options. You have 3 times 7. Not lots, but more. Take that back. Not lots. And 1 times 21. So there's really 4 different numbers that are factors of 21. If you multiply those, you get 21. And there's only 2 numbers that are factors of 7. But what is the greatest factor that appears in both lists? That would be 7, right? 7 shows up for a factor of 7, and 7 shows up for a factor of 21. It's the biggest number that they have in common. Now, sometimes when you do this process, you'll find several numbers that are in common in both lists, but it's not enough just to be common. It's called the greatest common factor for a reason. It has to be the biggest number possible that's also in common. So now that we know that 7 is the GCF, I'm going to put 7 underneath there. And then we're going to talk about the variable part. So what we just did is we got the GCF of the coefficient, but also you'll notice there are 2 x's. That's what x squared means. It's kind of a lazy man way of saying, hey, this is really 7 times x, but I don't want to put 2 x's, so they put x to the power of 2. It's like shorthand, right? So if you see x squared, that means there are 2 x's in this term. But if you only physically see an x next to 21, that means there's just 1 x on this term. So in common, they each have at least 1 x. This one has 2 x's. This one has just 1 x. But in common, the most amount they have in common is 1 x. So I have to include 1 x as part of my GCF, okay? It's not just the 7, which is the coefficient, it's also x. So the GCF between, which stands for greatest common factor, is 7x in this case. Now, when you're factoring, it's not enough just to say the GCF. You then want to put parentheses out next to it and do the division part, okay? That's how we get the factors of a polynomial. So once we found out that GCF is 7x, now we're going to take each term and we're going to divide it by the GCF. So let's start with the first one. 7x to the power of 2 divided by 7x. Well, 7 divided by 7 is 1, right? And then x squared divided by 1x. In other words, if you got 2 x's, you take away 1x, you're left with 1x. You can write that as 1x, right? Or you could just put x. Looks like my marker's running out a little bit. I might have to switch over. Give me just a second. I have a backup. Okay, the color will change, but you'll still get the point. All right, but that's going to equal 1x, okay? 1x. Now, after I divide that, I want to look at this. Now, think of this as like a negative number, okay? That's a negative 21x. So negative 21 divided by 7 is a negative 3. And notice it has an x. That has an x. Those x's would cancel out when you're dividing them. So we're simply just going to write that as x minus 3, okay? X take away 3. And we're done. You have factored this quadratic binomial, which is a type of polynomial. You have factored it already. All right. I'm going to get rid of those little underlines. And so how do I know I factored it right? If I multiply the 2 times each other, if I multiply and distribute them, then I'm going to get what I had originally. Okay. So that's just a little walkthrough, a little reminder on how you factor by the process of greatest common factor. And while we're on this subject, can I just say that anytime your teacher, if you're taking a traditional course, if you're taking an online course, if you're taking a course through me, right? Anytime anyone asks you to factor a polynomial, you have got to always check for a greatest common factor. That just needs to be protocol. That just needs to be automatic. Not every polynomial is going to have a greatest common factor, but it's your job to check for it. If there is one, we hold you responsible as math teachers to deal with it, right? To do the appropriate measures that you've learned to factor out that GCF, and that is just what it is. Okay, so that is a quick walkthrough on how you factor by the process of GCF. Now, I have one learner who is learning a slightly more challenging situation where you have to factor what's called a quadratic trinomial. The degree is 2, but there are 3 terms, and this is the thing. You don't have this person I'm talking about, you don't have a situation where there's a nice, pretty leading coefficient of 1. For example, I'm going to put this on the board here. I'm going to put up one like this. You got 2n squared plus 5n. I'm trying to find some good markers. Apparently, all mine are dying at the same time, which is never what you want. But we'll find something to work here. Okay, let's say you have a situation like this. Okay, hopefully you can see that all right. You got 2n squared plus 5n plus 2. All right, let's see if I can beat the ink down to the bottom. Okay, notice that there are coefficients in each term, right? You got 2, you got 5, you got 2 again, but there isn't a GCF. I mean, other than 1, there's not a GCF, right? 2 doesn't go into 5, so you can't say there's anything in common. There are 3 terms, and the degree is 2. So we call that a quadratic trinomial. Well, we were looking at a process. I call it the AC method. So if you took my class, you're familiar with this. But that's when you draw that X and you put, AC at the top and B. And remember, AC stands for the coefficients on the corners. So 2 is the A, B is the 5, and this other 2 would be the C. So AC would be A and C, 2 times 2, and 2 times 2 is equal to 4, right? The B is the middle coefficient, so that's equal to 5. Hopefully you can see that a little better. I'm trying to get the ink down there, right? And so what we talked about is when you're doing this process, it's a new method. You seem to like it. You want to find out what multiplies to the top number, the AC, and adds to the B. And you got a hem and haw. You could say, 2 times 2 equals 4. But if you add 2 plus 2, that does not equal 5. Oh, drats, right? Well, go back to the drawing board. What else equals 4 if you multiplied? And that would be 4 times 1. So I'm going to do 4, I'm going to do 1, and it looks like that's my winning combination, right? 4 times 1 is 4, but 4 plus 1 is 5. So that's what I go with, all right? Keep that in mind because now we're going to go back to the piece. Hopefully I can write this and it'll show up. I'm so sorry about the markers. What's going on with my markers? So we have 2n squared. But instead of 5n, we're going to change it to 1n and 4n because those are the two numbers that we got when we were doing the ACB method. Okay, take a look at this. I think it shows up a little bit. I just got to bear down hard. Okay, forgive me for the marker situation. So you got 2n squared plus 1n is what that is, plus 4n. Now, where did this come from? I thought this was a 3-term polynomial, and it was. But what we do with this process is we're breaking apart the 5n in the middle term, and we're changing it into 2 terms. We can do that because essentially they're the same thing. I mean, 1 plus 4 does equal 5. So if we break apart 5n, no harm, no foul. Now, Chris, why would you want to do that? It seems like you made life more complicated. Well, it's because with 4 terms, there's another method in factoring that you can use. It's super helpful. It's called the grouping method. The grouping method. So how do you group it? What you do is you put the first 2 in a parenthesis, the second 2 in a parenthesis, and each one of these you factor by GCF. So there's some crossover here. If you watch the video about how to factor by GCF, or the portion of this video, then you're going to see it comes into play again here. So you're going to find the GCF of each of the binomials, right? Well, that would be n. If I'm doing it quickly, that's going to give me n plus 1 once I divide it out. So the only thing they had in common was the n. I got n plus 1. Now right here, what they had in common is 2, and that's going to leave me with I think I messed up. Let's try that one more time. That should be 2n plus 1. This is what happens when you go too fast. All right. And that's going to give me 2n plus 1 as well. Okay. Now, if you're doing this the right way, hopefully you can see this okay. If you're doing this the right way, I told you this in class, the binomials you get here in the parentheses, they should be the same thing. We got 2n plus 1 on this side and 2n plus 1 on this side. If you didn't get the same 2 binomials at this point, then you made a mistake. You need to go back, check your division, check your factors. There's been some sort of miscalculation. If they're the same thing, that's a good sign that you're on the right track. You're simply going to write it one more time in parentheses, and the 2 GCFs that you had, in this case it's n and 2, they go in the other parenthesis, and you are done. Okay, these 2 right here at the very bottom, those are your factors. Now, Chris, that seems kind of long. Well, there's a few steps, but most of the steps are simple. And your alternative, if you don't want to use this method, honestly, in my opinion, is way worse because you have to do basically a guess and check method. You have to pick 2 factors that you think go into 2n squared and 2, and then you have to multiply it back out and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, you got to start all over. You erase it a whole bunch. It just gets so messy. the process gets so messy. Nobody likes that. Okay. And so we were working with this method. We tried it a few times in our session, and it was like, wow, a tried and true method that always works, and I don't have to keep guessing and checking. That sounds really good. So that's what we went with. So forgive me, I'm trying to test my markers here and see if I can get one that actually doesn't seem to run out on me. You think you got good markers, and then you use it a couple times, and then they start running out. We'll try this pink one, see if that shows up. Okay, moving on. Now, let's see. We did some factoring. We got one of my clients who's just working on a what I call algebra diagnostic, where you just have several different kinds of questions that what's the word? Several different kind of questions that uh, are a nice little touch on the different skills you learn throughout an algebra curriculum, whether that's algebra 1 or 2. And so it's going to be a little bit of a mix. Now, one thing I'll share with you, because I feel like we didn't get a chance to touch on this. One thing I'll share with you is going back to the property of exponents. And this is something that someone has to teach you. I mean, you have to be told this. And if you're not told this, you're going to miss it. It's just what it is. It's not something that you're going to just figure out probably on your own devices. Okay. Some of these questions, you can kind of take some of the skills we've been learning and figure it out if you don't exactly remember the specific formula. But this is one you need to be told. Okay. And that's what to do if you have a power or a degree that's negative. We're not allowed to simplify any answers and leave negative powers. That's considered a no-no. And so what you need to understand is how to get rid of a negative power. You actually, it's weird, but you put the base, so this parenthesis, everything in it would be considered the base being raised to a power of -3. You simply put it at the denominator of a fraction over 1. Now that sounds weird, but this is what it would look like. To get rid of that negative power, I'm going to take everything that's being raised to the -3, and I'm going to put it under 1. Okay? I'm going to put it under 1. Now, what that's going to do, it's going to take that 3 that was negative, and it becomes positive. Okay? That gets rid of the negative power. But you got to keep everything where it is now. You got 1 over. This is now in the denominator spot. Then you can go ahead and reduce it. So if you got 3 on the outside of parentheses, this is the power to a power property. Don't forget that power has to be applied to every base inside the parentheses. So, for example, y is a base, x is a base, but don't forget 4 is also a base. That 3 gets multiplied to every power that's there. Now, if you haven't heard this before, here's what you need to understand. Every base, for it to exist, has to at least be to the power of 1. Even if they don't physically show the 1 there, it's understood to be present. It's understood to be there. So when you're simplifying this, I'm just going to come out to the side. Keep it underneath 1, but that's going to become 3 times 1. So that's going to become 4 to the power of 3. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4, I believe, is 64. So you can go ahead and figure that out and call it 64. Okay, 4 cubed equals 64. You might as well say that. 3 to the power 1, 3 times 1 is 3. So that's going to become x to the power of 3. And then y squared, the 2 times the 3 gets multiplied. That's going to become y to the power of 6. So take a look right here. This over here on this section of the board is your simplified answer. So we got rid of the power that was negative by putting it under 1. The whole base goes underneath 1. And then we use the power to power property. And this is what you do. So this is something, I mean, there's so many topics and little details like that throughout the course of a algebra curriculum. You clearly can't cover every little tiny detail, but, over the course of time, pre-algebra, algebra 1, these are the things that the skill sets, especially when you take like the ACT or the SAT, depending on what your state tends to lean toward. These are some of the skill sets that they're going to be, assessing you for. And especially when you think about college entrance, that kind of comes into play. Okay. So real quick, I got some people taking my Money Made Simple program, and that's our 8-week, personal finance course for teens. And it's been really cool and rich at the age of teen. And I don't care if you're 19, 18, even. You're pretty much ignorant on this subject for the most part. I mean, there's every once in a while, there's a teen I've talked to whose parents have been proactive, but most of the time, I don't know why, in the United States of America, they just ignore personal finance. To me, it's a horrible sin. I think I don't know, maybe the banks are trying to take advantage. And so I don't know, something's weird, but I'll stay out of that. The point is, we're learning a lot. And this week we're covering the topic of credit and credit scores. And so just to kind of recap some things, I'll probably just kind of talk to you quite simply and maybe leave some comments in the chats. But those of y'all who are talking about credit, the definition of credit, I mean, you can find different ones, but basically I'll give you the Chris Morris definition. It's the world's way of giving you and reporting your financial reputation. It's your financial reputation. Okay. Credit is how banks and people who might want to lend you money, let's say you want to get a car and you need to borrow some money to buy a car and make payments, right? Or you want to buy a home, that's the biggie, right? Because that's an investment. If you want to buy a home and you need to borrow money, most people don't have $300, $400, $500,000 in the bank just ready to pay for. You might have to borrow that and make monthly payments. We've been working through mortgages the past week, but you're not going to get the best deal, right? Because banks charge what's called interest. Interest is money that the bank charges you extra for the use of their money. That's how they make their money. They have to loan money out and then they charge you money because you're using their money, and it's called interest. Well, you've noticed if you've done a 30-year note on a mortgage, for example, we looked at the breakdown. You're probably spending, no, you're not probably, in today's economy, you're spending more money over the course of 30 years. Most of the payments you made, more was paid towards interest than paying off your house. So essentially right now, if you did a 30-year note on a lot of these homes, the way the market is, it looks like you're going to pay more than twice the value of the home when you're done paying it off in 30 years. It's kind of a bad deal. I mean, you buy a $400,000 house, and that's with today's best interest rates. That's if you have good credit. Okay. We're not even talking about bad credit. Good credit right now, I think gets you about 6% because the Feds raised the interest rates. At 6%, you're looking at a $400,000 home. By the time you're done paying that off in 30 years, if you stick with the payment schedule, you might spend about $850 to $900,000 for a $400,000 home. I mean, it's just a ripoff. That's why we talked about how if you can afford it, it's better to do a 20-year note or a 15-year note because the interest that they're able to charge you is so much less. I mean, you're going to spend maybe $300,000 less for that same home if you make more payments or higher, more expensive payments, I guess, in the short term. You're not going to pay as much long term, right? And so anyway, that's a little quick recap. But just so you know, when it comes to credit scores, it pretty much ranges between 300, if you're talking about your score, up to 850, right? Those are the ranges. If you're in the 300s to 500s, that's pretty bad. You're going to have to pay higher interest for anything that you get a loan for. Right now, if you wanted to buy a home, unfortunately, it's higher than it used to be even a couple years ago. You're paying about 6% interest, probably, if you have really good credit. If you have bad credit, you probably aren't going to get the loan. But if you were able to find somebody who'll give you the loan, I mean, who knows what the interest rate will be? They might charge you twice that. There might be 12% interest. I don't think you need to be buying a home if the interest is that right now. That sounds like a death note, literally. So we don't want to have bad credit, right? So we talked about the categories there and how excellent credit ranges from 720 up to 850. Now, when it comes to credit, the 5 factors that make up your credit score is something that was enlightening for our students. And I'm going to just recap that because I think it's very important that you know what you need to be doing to boost your credit score. If your credit score is higher, you don't have to pay as much money for the things that you have to loan, the payments that you have to borrow, right? Your car note will be, maybe $100 or $150 less than somebody else who has bad credit, right? Your mortgage payments can save you thousands if you have good credit versus if you have bad credit, right? You want to save, it's money in your pocket if you can have a better credit score. We talked about how even, when you're setting up, let's say you're in your 20s, right? You're trying to get your first apartment. And that's usually kind of the stage my clientele is at. We talked about how sometimes, these people will come out to set up your utilities or your cable or whatever, and they'll charge you some sort of setup fee to come out and install everything, right? Well, if you just tell them, hey, if you do a soft credit and check my credit, will you waive the setup fee? And a lot of times the answer is yes. I've saved over, probably a couple $1,000s when it's all said and done, just mentioning that when I'm just going about my adult life, right? And because they check my credit, they're like, oh, this person's going to make their payments. We don't have to worry about it. We will give them a break when it comes to the setup fee, right? It's all about trustworthiness. So real quick, the 5 factors that make up your credit score, just want to recap that real quick. It's payment history. That's numero uno, number 1. That makes up 35% of your score. Most of what factors into your credit score being good or bad is, do you pay your bills on time? Do you pay your bills on time? If you even miss one payment, it can hurt a lot. So your priority is be balanced. Don't buy things you can't afford and make payments on time. Okay. After that, it's the amount you owe weighted. So that's about 30%. So for example, we talked about this. When you have a credit card, okay, which I don't suggest you going crazy with credit cards, but let's say you get a credit card, your first one, and it has what's called a credit limit. That means they won't allow you to put more on the credit card than a certain number. A lot of times that's about $1,000 when you're starting out. Okay, so let's say you have a credit limit of $1,000. It's a good idea to not carry more debt on that. Just because you can spend 1,000 doesn't mean you should, put 1,000 on it, right? Maybe 150 to $300 is how much you should keep on there as a balance as you're making payments. You don't really want to use all your available credit. What that tells the financial people, okay, that tells them this person maxes out everything that they can. They probably don't have the money for what they're buying. They don't have self control, so it makes your credit go down. You don't want to go more than 30% of what your limit is. Now, if you have a credit limit way higher, like 10,000, okay, then you could spend up to $3,000 and it still should be okay. You should still be good in as far as moving up the credit score. But if you go higher than that and your balance stays continually higher than that, not a good idea. The other thing we talked about is how many different applications for credit you're trying to do in a short period of time. For example, in 1 year, I don't want to look at your credit report and find out that you applied to 6 different credit cards and took out also a student loan and also took out, you know what I mean? If you're or maybe you did some financial thing to buy furniture and you have all these situations where you're getting yourself in debt in a short period of time, it will hurt your score. Okay. So I don't want to say too much on here because I'd rather you take the course and learn it in detail, but I wanted to just refresh some of the important things. We talked about some of the 5 ways that you can, steps you can take to boost your score now, and even the 5 things you want to avoid that a lot of people don't know, including adults, that hurt your score. And so you want a good credit score, right? You're going to have situations in life where, especially, wealth building, like owning property, you want to be able to do that and you want to be able to have a low interest rate. So anyway, I'm trying to think if I covered everything. I got so many different topics that I wanted to touch on. Oh yeah, the last thing I want to touch on for my Math Made Simple folks, and that's just pretty simple. We are covering multiplication tables. Parents, can I just talk to you for a second? Do not be light on the multiplication facts. You would be amazed how many high schoolers, middle schoolers I work with on a daily basis that do not know their multiplication facts. Okay. And when I say don't know them, I mean really don't know them. I mean, have to have a calculator to tell me what half of 12 is. I mean, sometimes it's that bad. Don't do that to your learner when they're, especially through 5th grade. By the time they're at 5th grade, really by the time they're 3rd grade, I'd love it. But by the time they're in 5th grade, they need to know their multiplication facts. And if they don't, make it a priority. They're going to struggle hard at the pre-algebra, algebra level if they don't know their multiplication facts. We're looking right now, you've seen how we're doing factoring of polynomials. Well, if you don't even know the factors of individual numbers, the polynomial part is going to be, you're going to be out of mental energy by the time you get to what I need you to, get to. And so it's just going to help them in life. It's going to help them with budgeting their money. So a good website, I'm just referencing real fast, is timestables.com, timestables.com. I love it. You have so many ways you can go through you can go through the 2's times tables up to 12. You can go to the 3 times tables. You can see it on the chart. They have little games. They can shuffle it. They have, little cards that'll flip and you can quiz yourself. There's, multiple games and speed test times. It's really fun. I like to use it when I'm tutoring. But there's so many things and it's free, and you just have them spend 30 minutes, a day or whatever till they get through their 2's and their 3's and their 4's, and just take it a times table or 2 at a time. Maybe the 2's and the 3's you can drill for a week until they get really good there, and then move on to the 4's and the 5's. So if timestables.com, I left a link to it in the description. You can click on that. And if you're working on me, this is one of the few areas in math that you honestly, it's a memorization thing. It really just is. You have to use your brain power and calculation power for other formulas and some other kind of higher end things down the line. So you want to have this bank of knowledge that you can draw to really easily, so you don't have to waste all your energy when we need to put our energy towards maybe the macro, if that makes sense. Okay. So I just wanted to touch on that and just emphasize it to parents who kind of like, oh, well, they don't really, you're not doing your kid a favor. We need to prioritize their multiplication facts. They got to know them. It's going to make the rest, math builds on itself. It's going to make the rest of their time in high school and then even in life so much smoother if you do. All right, that's all I got to say on this one. I love you guys. Check the replay if you didn't get a chance to watch it live, and reach out to me if you ever have any questions, need help with math. That's why I'm here. I love you guys. I'll catch you on the next one.